Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Welcome to our first event called Global Persecution of Lawyers. This is the first event being put on by what is now called the Task Force on Independence of Lawyers and Judges. We are a task force of the New York City Bar Association, and the first thing I'd like to do is give an advertisement for ourselves. We are newly formed. We are lucky to have a remarkably active group already, but we're always looking for more people who want to work for free on good causes. And in this case, the good cause is the independence of lawyers and judges. So if you're interested, please come up to me after the program and press your card on me, or I'll press mine on you, and you can get involved. I'd also like to thank a couple people who've done a great deal of work on putting this program together. Martin Flaherty is our guru, the head of the Council on International Affairs, which spawned the task force originally. Alora Thomas was our initial chair, and we thank her for her service. Chris Piak has been doing a huge amount of work, both as a member of the Council on International Affairs and as a member of the task force to get this event organized. The people at the City Bar, of course, have done a lot to organize things for us as well. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors. I won't name all of them because I'm very happy to say a whole lot of people co-sponsored us, and their names are written down, including some of our fellow bar associations overseas. And because this issue is a global issue, I think it's especially important that we look for commonalities. And one thing I hope we can hear today from our panelists is how the issues may be the same or they may differ across the world. With that, I'm just going to move on to introducing Jerry Cohen, Professor Cohen, who's our moderator today. There's a long list of things one could say about him. What I would like to say about him, because everybody knows he's a great genius and a great expert and a great guy and has done an awful lot of good things and teaches at NYU. But I don't know whether people here know quite how loyal people are to him. I first met him 20, 30 years ago when someone I knew said, "You have to meet Jerry Cohen." And I sort of come across him now in person about every 5 to 10 years. But I see people almost once a month who talk about Jerry Cohen all over the world, but especially in Hong Kong and in New York. So we thank you for everything you've done, Jerry, including being our moderator tonight. Please moderate.
Thanks, Willie. This room has had many distinguished events, and it's been my privilege to take part in a few of them. Going back, I think, to 1965, if you could believe it, when, just as the Cultural Revolution was beginning in China, we had an evening here about efforts to develop a rule of law in that great country. We also had a terrific program here in 1999 about the problem of Taiwan and its relation to mainland China, the international legal questions involved, questions that have yet to be dealt with, and I hope they won't cause us too much trouble in the future. What we've seen, of course, in recent decades is some developments toward more democratic rule of law in many countries, and then some very adverse developments, and then some mixed situations. And tonight is an occasion for getting some perspective by looking at a range of countries, and I hope that will be instructive for us. We'll be looking first at Venezuela and Cuba, which should be of great interest, and the two of them make interesting contrasts. We'll also be talking about Russia, to what extent things have improved for lawyers since the decline and end of the Soviet system. We'll be talking, in addition, about Turkey, so much in the news these days and very controversial. And certainly China, I'm not sure whether we'll be talking about Uganda tonight because I don't see Mr. Otonu. I don't know if we have any word. Martin, do we know? I was looking forward to meeting him because I'm sure he must be related to a brilliant former student of mine, Olara Otonu. Some of you may know from his work at the UN. And Olara's younger brother, Omara, whom I helped get out of Uganda, saving his life, he told me, because of the difficulties that democratic family has had. So let's hope he shows up, but we've got plenty to talk about. And of course, the issues, from my point of view, tend to be the same in every country in terms of who's admitted to the practice of law. Do you have barefoot lawyers, as they're sometimes called in China, if they're not formally legally educated, but nevertheless try to represent people, especially in criminal cases, but also in others? What sanctions are imposed if you get by the admission standards imposed? What are the criteria for renewing your appointment? To what extent you're allowed access to clients? What happens when you go to the police station if they don't let you in? What resources can you draw upon in order to stimulate police cooperation or prosecutorial cooperation? What about coerced confessions, torture, which is so common? Even China admitted the other day that someone died in prison during a detention as a result of torture by officials. That was a rare Chinese admission. And of course, is there something resembling what we would call a fair trial, invoking international standards for a fair trial? And what about judgment, conviction, sentencing, appeal, death penalty particularly? How arbitrary is it? What measures are there for relief against perceived wrongful conviction? These issues run through every society. And I look forward to getting informed about countries I know all too little about tonight. And I'll join Ms. Liu Wei after she leads us off about China, and hope we can produce a stimulating discussion for you that will lead to your participation, your questions, but also your comments and your experiences. I'm not going to give extensive bios for each of the speakers because we have that. And I'm so new at learning from some of them that I'll be glad if I can just pronounce their names correctly. We're going to start with the Spanish language challenge from Javier El Aje.
Perfect.
I hope I haven't forgotten my Spanish. And he's going to talk in the first instance about Venezuela and Cuba. And later, I hope to hear from him about Bolivia, which he also knows a great deal about. Each of the speakers is being asked to speak 5 minutes or so to start. This will allow time for discussion among us and then with the audience. It should be a very stimulating evening. And we'll go to about 8 o'clock, and we can stay a little longer if the situation warrants. And I welcome all of you. So, Javier, why don't you come and start us off?
Thank you very much, Professor Cohn. I'll try to stick to the 5 minutes. The Human Rights Foundation, which is the organization I have the privilege to serve as Chief Legal Officer, focuses on authoritarian countries alone. To define what authoritarian countries are, obviously, we have to resort to political science and to some empirical work by others, as much of it is not legal work or traditionally legal work. And for that, we follow the definitions of professors Steve Levitsky from Harvard University and Lucan Wei from Toronto University, and they find there are around 95 countries in the world total right now that are either fully authoritarian, that is your traditional dictatorship, or competitive authoritarian, which is this sort of hybrid regime that they came up with in this great book from 2008. When you narrow it down to the Americas, that means 5 countries according to our calculation, which is Cuba, the only fully authoritarian regime in the Americas, truly, and then Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua as competitive authoritarian regimes, Venezuela being a borderline country right now, an almost fully authoritarian regime. So to start, I'm going to focus on Cuba and Venezuela today, and then maybe in the Q&A do a little bit of Ecuador and Bolivia. But about Cuba and Venezuela, let's start by saying that there's a distinct difference between Cuba and Venezuela. Most competitive and fully authoritarian regimes lack judicial independence. That is, judges are not expected to rule in your favor if you're litigating against the government. That's clear. There's no judicial independence in authoritarian countries, even competitive authoritarian ones. But Cuba is distinct in that it also lacks any sort of independence for lawyers. So there is no such thing as a lawyer that disagree with the government. This starts with the code of ethics for lawyers. All lawyers in Cuba, in order to practice, they have to be barred in something called the Organización Nacional de Bufetes Colectivos, or the National Organization of Collective Law Firms or Law Offices. You get scrutinized from law school. So, for example, just to show you this gentleman that is sitting next to President Obama, his name is Manuel Cuesta Murúa. He was a law student until in the 5th year, they found in his backpack a book, a political book that he was not supposed to be reading, a book that was banned in Cuba. And so he was kicked out of law school. He's not a lawyer, although he knows a lot of constitutional law, and he runs his small nonprofit teaching people, sort of like the barefoot lawyers that Professor Cohen was mentioning in a model in China. So that's an example of what happens with lawyers. This comes again to the Code of Ethics of the ONBC, which states literally, and I quote, that lawyers must consciously assume and contribute within their duties to defend, preserve, and be faithful to the principles comprised in the nation, the revolution, and socialism, and that they must do this imbued with the righteous, noble, and humane ideas of socialism, and inspired, in case there's any doubt on how to define socialism, by the example set by the Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz. So it's an ethical obligation for lawyers in Cuba to reject cases when it comes to criticism of the government. This is the most high-profile case lately, the case of artist El Sexto, who spray-painted a wall the day, hours after Fidel Castro died, with the words, "He's gone, se fue." He did this on a wall that, by the way, had government speech. For those of you that are thinking about the First Amendment implications of this, a wall that had a picture of Fidel Castro, etc. So he was the next day arrested, and his artist friend went to a lawyer. The lawyer, after he told the story of what had happened the day before, the lawyer went at him and said, like, "How is it possible that he did this?" So that's the reaction of a lawyer when you come with a case of criticism of the government. So the lawyer needs to excuse himself or herself, as it was the case this time. So there are some independent lawyers like Laritza Diversen, who's a true hero. She is an attorney, but has since been not allowed to. Has in the past few years, since she runs the Cuba Lex database, and she counsels a number of opposition figures inside Cuba. She's not, she's beaten just as other activists there. She's taken as an activist, and her office was raided just a couple of months ago. So she was also, by the way, sitting next to President Obama. Her name is right there, Laritza Diversen, at the bottom corner. So she was also a high-profile prisoner, but that doesn't protect her from, again, illegal searches and seizures, etc. We internationally try to take these cases to a UN working group on arbitrary detention through these type of petitions. They respond to us. The government also responds and says, everything that they are saying is nonsense. Anyone in Cuba can access a lawyer. Obviously, that is not true. If you disagree with the government, it's your ethical obligation not to defend people like Danilo Maldonado that I just mentioned. There are a couple of books, good reports about this. This particular one from 1962 by the International Commission of Jurists. Unfortunately, not much has changed in the legal system in Cuba since, so their description of how the legal system works generally is still very good. There's this other much more recent book from a professor in Argentina, and there is this report that we wrote just a year ago that has a very updated version of how the legal system works there. Then Venezuela, just quickly, quick overview. Venezuela, obviously, there are lawyers. There is such thing as independent lawyers. I would argue that even most lawyers in bar associations and in civil society disagree with the government. So the ones that are, however, completely subservient to the government are the ones in the judiciary. So the judiciary is completely taken over by the executive in Venezuela, but the lawyers are still largely independent. That said, they face persecution in at least two ways. One, if the lawyers decide to enter politics actively, like Yon Goicoechea, who did an LLM at Columbia Law School just a few years ago, that decided to enter politics when he was back in Caracas just last year. He was arrested. They planted guns in his vehicle, and he has been a political prisoner since. There are over 100 political prisoners in Venezuela. Then there is Alan Brewer Carillas. Some of you might know him. He taught at Columbia for a couple of years right after his exile in 2003. His crime also plotting to overthrow the government according to the government, he was accused of having authored a coup-related decree. Then this is probably the most prominent network of lawyers in Venezuela. There is no such thing as lawyers in Cuba, for example, that have all that amount of microphones. It would be impossible. In Venezuela, there are still lawyers, and there is this great network of courageous criminal attorneys called the Foro Penal Venezolano. Some of the people that you see in those pictures, Tamara Suju, for example, has been exiled for 2 years now in the Czech Republic, so they do face persecution. But some of the most high-profile leaders like Alfredo Romero and Gonzalo Imiop, who are the two main guys that you see in the pictures, they still get to do their work. They still get to go in and out of Venezuela, and they still get to defend mostly high-profile cases and political prisoners. So I'll leave it at that for my introduction, then hopefully later be able to answer questions.
That's a very
Thank
good
you.
introduction. Thank you. You showed revolutionary discipline in doing it within the allotted time. Now we're going to hear from Melissa Hooper, who is one of the most active human rights lawyers and legal specialists in the metropolitan area. Melissa, you want to stay seated, or how do you want to do it? Either way is fine.
Okay, I figured that I will stay seated if that's okay.
Sure.
I'll sit up, though. So let's see. In Russia, it's interesting to hear some similarities, especially when you talk about Venezuela. In Russia, as you probably know, there is something called telephone justice. So there is no independent judiciary, but there are definitely independent lawyers, and that leads to definite persecution of lawyers. There have been 70 lawyers killed in Russia from 2000 to 2014, two of the most famous being Sergei Magnitsky, who you may have heard of, who was killed after he investigated and came up with a great deal of evidence related to high-level corruption in Russia, and then Stanislav Markelov, who is a human rights lawyer who is litigating cases in Chechnya, who was also killed. They were killed the same year in 2009. Right now, I think that the recent trends in terms of persecution of lawyers have to do with a larger trend that you see in Russia related to the use of what was, I think, more in 2015, espionage and treason charges, and then the authorities got really clever and started using extremism, separatism, incitement of hatred charges, which is interesting both because you see in Venezuela, planning of a coup is one of the charges that's used, and also interesting to me because you're starting to see some of this discussion of extremism in the United States as something that we want to be careful about in our officials, or we want to be careful about who we're allowing into the country. So how that plays out in Russia is that because of Russia's occupation of Crimea, you've had a real ramp up in prosecution of individuals who state in public, but also state online, that they believe that Crimea is Ukraine or that Russia should not be in Crimea. And there have been a lot of changes in the laws from 2012 to 2016 that have made it much easier to prosecute people. And then as a result, lawyers that attempt to represent those that are saying Crimea is Ukraine are themselves being arrested and detained. So in large part right now, in January, you've seen a number of Crimean Tatars being arrested and then their lawyers being arrested for trying to represent them, for going to their house when they're being searched, or you have the lawyers' premises being searched as the government tries to collect information illegally by just searching the lawyers. You have clients not being able to see their lawyers and being tortured. That has been mentioned as a common problem, and that, yes, that is happening quite a lot in Russia. And then you have instances where organizations such as the Crimean Tatar Majlis, which is basically just a representative organization where Crimean Tatars get together, and Crimean Tatars are, I should mention, mostly Muslim, also significant. And so those lawyers that are trying to represent individuals involved in the Majlis are being targeted. What's happening to them? They're not being killed. That's great. But they are being arrested. They are being pressured. They're being harassed. There is a lawyer, Ivan Pavlov, in St. Petersburg who's gained a bit of notoriety for representing a lot of clients in terrorism-related cases. And he has said, none of my clients are terrorists. This is all political. And he faces quite a lot of pressure and says, on a regular basis, I come home and there are journalists or government people standing outside my house, and I don't know who. There's just people following him around. But as with many lawyers in Russia, he just continues to do what he does. And there are so many brave lawyers there that are taking up this task. Let's see, I'll end with the most recent death in the region actually was of a lawyer in Ukraine who was representing 2 Russians who were charged with espionage. The interesting thing about that is that there's discussion about who might have killed them, that it could have been Russian Secret Service, it could have been Ukrainian. And so I think that the Crimea situation has created much danger for those that are politically active and then for those lawyers that try to represent them. Thanks.
Very good. Now we'll hear from Nate Shenkan, who knows about Turkey.
Okay, great. I'll also stay seated in the interests of time and economy. Thanks. I represent Freedom House, the human rights organization from its New York offices. I work on a project called Nations in Transit, and I also work on Turkey. I'll blow through the background really quickly because what's happening in Turkey is kind of extraordinary, and it would take hours just to go through how we got here. The very short version is that there is an incredible high-intensity crackdown that's happening right now in Turkey on all spheres of society, including lawyers, judges, prosecutors. The proximate cause of that is the coup attempt that happened in July 2016. But this crackdown is actually a continuation of one that predates the coup attempt, and that started in December 2013 when there was a very high-profile corruption investigation launched against the government by prosecutors and police. That resulted in a very harsh crackback from the government led by the then Prime Minister, now the President, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So all the way back, if we look back at end of 2013, spring 2014, already at that time you were having tens of thousands of police fired and reassigned, thousands of judges and prosecutors fired and reassigned around the country, major changes in how judges were appointed, and very heavy pressure on the Constitutional Court. So this is all taking place throughout 2014 into 2015. In 2015, we have a return to war inside of Turkey with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a terrorist organization designated by the United States that's been engaged in a civil war with the state of Turkey for 3 decades. Since July 2015, there have been about 2,600 people killed in Turkey just in that conflict with the PKK, roughly 400 of those civilians. That has also had major impacts on lawyers and on judges and prosecutors. Finally, the coup attempt last summer on July 15th, 2016. The government, President Erdogan and his government, have labeled the coup attempt from the very start an attempt by the Gulen movement, which is an Islamist movement that they had previously been allied with. They had labeled the coup attempt a continuation of the Gulen movement's attempts to overthrow them because they regarded the December 2013 corruption investigation also as a coup attempt against the government. That has meant that, first and foremost, among those targeted in the crackdown after the coup attempt are those that are considered to be affiliated with the Gulen movement. That includes, I think it's 148 journalists now in prison, 180 media outlets that have been closed, over 1,000 NGOs that have been closed. Among lawyers, there isn't a single comprehensive list or number of lawyers that have been targeted in the crackdown. There is a Gulen-affiliated group of lawyers working out of Europe who are monitoring the situation from exile. They say the number is about 349 lawyers currently in prison, and 867 in total who are facing prosecution. In addition, you have about, we're not sure how many, in August, Human Rights Watch said 1,684 judges and prosecutors who are in jail, in pretrial detention, and I don't have an updated number for how many have been released or formally charged. In most of these post-coup cases, no one's been formally charged yet. They're simply being held awaiting charges, which you can do in Turkey for up to 5 years. The kinds of charges, practically everyone swept up in this crackdown post-coup. They're drawing on the emergency powers that are granted under emergency rule, which the government enacted immediately following the coup attempt and have kept in force since. So Turkey's been under emergency rule for 8 months, and that shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. People are largely charged with things like attempting a coup, seeking to overturn the constitutional order, membership in a terrorist organization. All of this is enabled by Turkey's very broad anti-terror laws, overly broad, very vague, which have existed for decades. And this is not a new development, and they've been a real target for reform by the EU and by other international actors seeking to bring Turkey's legal standards closer to Western norms. That effort clearly has not borne fruit yet. And so under Turkish law, it is adequate to, for instance, have used a particular messaging app. There's a messaging app that the government considers to be affiliated with the Gulen movement. It's called Baylok. The government says that the Gulen movement created it in order to conspire amongst themselves, and that the Turkish government has hacked this app and has a list of probably several 100,000 people that it then considers to be affiliated. And that is probably one of the main sources for the firings, forced resignations, and arrests going across the country. Finally, sorry I'm going a little long, I would be derelict if I neglected to say that in addition to the Gulen targeting, the targeting of those affiliated with the Gulen movement, the crackdown very much is targeting the, let's say, traditional targets of repression inside of Turkey, especially leftists and Kurdish nationalists. So of those 349 lawyers that I mentioned, it could be some 50, 60, maybe more are associated with leftist or Kurdish causes. And you see this in other areas of the crackdown also. The bulk are affiliated in some way with the Gulen movement, but you also have a pretty large minority who are associated with leftist and Kurdish causes. And they're also being fired from public service jobs, forced out of universities, or arrested. That's I know it's it's a lot of information and it's a lot of a crackdown, but I'm happy to answer any more questions about it. The scale, I can't understate how awful it is.
Thank you, Nate. Now we'll hear from Ms. Liu Wei, who has a lot of practical experience and more recently has been in New York acquiring further academic analytical training.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm a human rights lawyer from China. I came to U.S. at 2014 as a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School, and then I came to NYU as a fellow in U.S. Asia Law Institute. Now, I'm turning to Fordham Law School, studying my LLM degree there. I'm still in Fordham Law School right now. But what I want to see today, it might be a little bit challenging for me because of, in the past, I usually do a lot of presentations in the different places, but never like this. I looking those people's, those lawyers, and also hearing from the other lawyers talking about the other prosecution to the other countries. I was so emotional right now. I want to ask you, what is your feeling today? For me, the feeling is very complicated today. It may be a normal day to you, but it's not a normal day to me. Because of when I get up today, I found my tears on my cheek, and I began to start my fast today, just like what I did just 3 years in the same day. Because today is the 3 years that a case happened. I still could remember that what happened 3 years ago at the same day, just like what happened in my dream yesterday. I woke up in the hotel in Yangzhou. It's a city in China. On March 21, 2014, I was going to meet with my partner. Then we're supposed to go to a law firm and to organize a workshop on domestic violence for the local lawyers in Yangzhou City. It's just like what we did before, what I did in the past 2-3 years. Then we were supposed to go to meet the students in a panel discussion, also talk about domestic violence and birth control, those kind of women's and children's issues in Yangzhou University. But my phone rang. It was my partner, another female lawyer. She mentioned in the phone, said she couldn't join me today. Why? Because she's going to Jianshanjiang. It's in Dongbei of China, where 4 human rights lawyers, Tang Jitian, Jiang Tianyong, Wang Cheng, Zhang Junjie, were arrested and beat badly because of helping rescue people practicing Falun Gong. 4 lawyers, 24 broken ribs. Can you imagine that? I can't stop crying. I'm not an easy crying people. But that day, I know time changed. I couldn't just work like before, do what I want to do, and help people who I want to help. You may facing risks, being missing, being tortured, even being killed. So my partner, another human rights lawyers in the law firm in Zhengzhou, which is my hometown, lawyer Chang Boyang was being arrested because of running illegal business. What is illegal business? It's our non-government organization. It's called Yirenping. And I was facing the same charge, same crimes, because I was a board member of that organization. But I was lucky because of, at the same time, I got the Panelists fellowship. So I applied for a visa in Hong Kong and come to New York and study in Columbia Law School. I was lucky, but not like the other people. The things didn't get better since then. July 9th, 2015, since the family lawyer Wang Yu, one of our executive members, was being arrested in the May night. Over 300 lawyers was being arrested, questioned, harassed by authorities in the following 2 months. Until right now, it's still have at least 319 lawyers, law firm staffs, human rights advocates, and family members was being questioned, summoned, forbidden to leave the country, held under house arrest, residential surveillance, criminal, detained, arrested, or missing. Lawyer Wang Yu was being set free on bail last June. But until right now, we couldn't connect with her, and we don't know where is her. Nobody can talk to her. Lawyer Xie Yang was being tortured, and her lawyer's wife, her wife is also a lawyer, and also a law professor, bring $2, flee to Thailand 1 week ago. Actually, it's at the beginning of this month, March. And they were being arrested in Thailand. But now, with the help of the U.S. Embassy, they got safe. I hope it will be safe for them to come to U.S., but we will see. There were so many informations I would like to provide it. There are so many feelings or things can be done, but I will leave the sentences here, and we will talk it later. Thank you.
One of the fascinating questions about persecution of lawyers is why lawyers continue to do their work in the face of persecution. What gives them the courage, the stamina to expose themselves and their families to the kinds of sanctions that you've heard some reference to? In China, some of the criminal defense lawyers are motivated by religion, Western religion. Some of them are believers in Christianity, and that often combined with Jeffersonian ideology, and it makes for the kind of fuel that keeps them going under extremely adverse conditions. And of course, China is not unique in that regard. One of the leading Chinese lawyers who suffered horribly, Gao Zhisheng, he combined the belief in Jefferson's view about sometimes the tree of liberty has to be nourished by the blood of patriots. And he particularly seemed to have a kind of martyr complex. I remember in March 2006 sitting in a major hotel in Beijing with about a dozen human rights lawyers, and we were debating what is the right strategy. Is the right strategy to fight according to the unfair restrictions imposed by the current rules, one arm tied behind you, but still being able to fight? Or is the right strategy to go all out and recognize, as Gao Zhisheng said, there'll never be true justice, there'll never be a genuine rule of law in China as long as the Communist Party retains its monopoly of power. Most of the 12 there, 8 or 9 of them, took the practical approach. It's better to be on the street and try to help even if your help is limited than not to be on the street and available at all. Gao took the opposite position, only a couple of others there agreed with him. And I said to him, you're right, of course, but if you persist in saying this in public, in a few months' time, you won't be any good to anybody. And he was the bravest of the many brave human rights lawyers I've known in China. He had been voted one of the outstanding lawyers in China before he became too controversial. And he suffered horribly after that. He suffered terrible torture. They turned him for a while into a vegetable. And they can do it to any of us if the sanctions are severe enough. And he's still not back in action. He seems to have made some personal recovery, but isn't allowed back in Beijing. He's not allowed to be active. He's sort of in exile at his home village. His wife and 2 children, in the meantime, had fled to the United States, and they've been separated for some time. Now, that was in an era a few years ago before families began to suffer. And I thought maybe we should talk about sanctions, the variety of sanctions that various regimes impose upon lawyers in order to try to get them in line. In China, the sanctions range from disbarment, and if you're convicted of a crime, you are automatically disbarred. The sanctions can go against your law firm also. There's often a lot of pressure on law firms not to allow their partners or associates to engage in controversial work. Often, the law firm and the lawyer have to get approval of the local party authority in order to undertake controversial cases. And Liu Wei mentioned Falun Gong. That's the most controversial. The leaders of China thought Falun Gong were all right until they demonstrated the capacity to put 10,000 people protesting in front of the National Party headquarters, and the secret police had no clue that it was going to happen. And that frightened the regime terribly. And since then, the Falun Gong people have been the principal, certainly not the only, but maybe the major group that has been subjected to horrible sanctions, including death in prison. And any lawyers associated with them have been subject to punishment. And the punishment, of course, can extend to your family. Some of these families are lawyers, husband and wife, and they've both been punished in some cases, and even their children. One of the first things of traditional Chinese punishment that was abolished at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when Western law reform imperial influences, etc., caused change was to get rid of collective punishment, the punishment of an accused family as well as the accused person himself. And in practice, that seems now to have been resurrected in China. I think Liu Wei was referring to one case where the 16-year-old son of a husband and wife couple, human rights lawyers both detained, escaped to Thailand with the hope of going to Australia to continue his high school education. And the government managed to haul him back with the cooperation of the Thai authorities. And you have to worry about your children often in the course of interrogation of lawyers and their clients. There are more than vague references to the ability to punish children as well as the lawyers. But as you've heard from several of our speakers, lawyers can be formally arrested, and whether tortured or not, they can be convicted. Often in China, they're not convicted. They're held, they're prosecuted. Sometimes the case is dropped. Occasionally, they're even acquitted. But in the meantime, they've been detained for 2 years. Their reputation has been impugned. Their source of income has been damaged or eliminated. They've had to try to get back on their feet economically, but they're often disbarred even if they haven't been convicted. So this is, it's not a happy situation, to say the least. And it'd be interesting to hear from any of our panel if you want to say anything about the kinds of sanctions. Is there anything distinctive in the countries you're familiar with about the nature of the punishment that lawyers expose themselves to? I don't know if you want. I'm curious, of course, about Russia because the Soviet system was ended in Russia. I was familiar with the ways lawyers were punished, inhibited in the Soviet Union. I visited Moscow on a number of occasions in order to find comparisons with China. And I expected that things would get much better once the formal Soviet system had really disappeared. And it may be it's something simply in the country's tradition that makes it difficult, but I took some hope from visiting Moscow in 1964. I remember I met some lawyers. Of course, they were under restraints, but still they felt they could play a role. Maybe it was still an optimistic era in the Khrushchev time. And I remember one lawyer saying, when there are cases in Vladivostok that need high-level talent, they fly me out there. And you could see, even though he wasn't paid very much, the professional pride he saw in what he could do was a sustaining sort of support for the work he had to do under considerable restraints. And maybe that's one of the compensations that some of these human rights lawyers really get out of their suffering. I remember in the Philippines, under Marcos, talking to lawyers, some of whom were directly trained in America, some were indirectly because of the Philippine legal education. And I wondered at the courage of these people. What really made them continue when they could have found safer aspects of work? But I'm trying to provoke some comments from some of you, if you see any analogies.
Well, I think, Jerry, you've mentioned two subjects that maybe the panelists could comment on. One is what motivates these lawyers to keep doing something which is tantamount to martyrdom, or at least economically stupid.
Yeah.
And the second is, are there any particular sanctions or techniques which these governments are using in these different countries? So, do we have comments from the panel?
Javier, you looked like you were on the verge of saying something.
I think Well, even in the most totalitarian of systems like Cuba's or like the former Soviet Union, the legal profession still was something complex, something reserved for people that liked studying. Maybe in the process of studying, they decided that this was a mock system in which they had to play by the rules of the system. But this sense of prestige of the legal profession still exists even in countries like Cuba. So I think that motivates people like Manuel Cuesta Murua. In fact, the story of him having been disbarred on the 5th year for having a book on his backpack, that's not a story that he tells all the time. I'm pretty sure that he had an hour with President Obama. He probably wouldn't mention it unless President Obama said, "Did you actually graduate from law school? How is that possible?" Most people assume that he's a lawyer. He says, "I'm a constitutional lawyer," because he is a constitutional lawyer. He's an expert in constitutional law. But so I asked that question because I practice in this field and I'm familiar with the fact that how is it possible that he got his constitutional law degree in the first place? So I asked the question. He said, "You know what? I didn't get the degree. I was kicked out on the last year." But he doesn't see this as a badge of honor and that he goes and says, "I was disbarred because I disagree with the government." He sees himself as a lawyer. He sees that there is a purpose on defending the rule of law in a country like Cuba. And in fact, both his project, his group is called Arco Progresista, as well as Laritza Diversen's project called Cuba Legs, is based on training other lawyers and individuals generally to use the laws in the Cuban legal system, both the Constitution and lower statutes, in trying to push for change. For example, right now, those movements are involved in trying to participate, to train all the people in the opposition to participate in the elections, even though they're still the Communist Party election, in which at the end of the day is the CDRs, the Comités de Defensa de la Revolución, the Revolution Defense Committees that are run by the political police that will make the decision on who are the candidates. But according to the law, anyone that is a member of that is a member of that society can come to those meetings and propose a candidate. So they are applying those laws, even though they will face repression, because they believe in being lawyers and in making the most of the legal systems they work under.
You know, we're talking about human rights lawyers. Listening to your presentation, I got the feeling that almost all lawyers in Cuba were feeling this pressure and political. In China, it's not that way. We're really talking about a small number of gallant people who managed to replace themselves. But they're just a tiny minority of hundreds of thousands of lawyers now. And most people, if they just do commercial law and keep their nose clean, they don't know anything. They're even some of my former students who go back to China and practice, they claim to be surprised that the secret police are still all around.
And you can find the same, for example, in competitive authoritarian countries, Bolivia, Ecuador. Unless it's a very politically charged case, your regular commercial lawyer, you can have firms from here that have offices there and they're working fine.
But what about corruption?
The cases of Cuba, the case of Cuba is unique in that there's no such thing as a civil lawyer. Killing a cow is illegal. So there is no, since property rights are are non-existent really, they work, the current cuentapropistas work under a special license by the government. There is no legal work to be done, especially on the civil field. On the criminal field, yes, if someone, a neighbor kills another neighbor, then he will, that lawyer will get to go to court. He will get to exercise a fairly independent function, unless, of course, someone involved in the killing has anything to do with the government or the political police, in which case then suddenly the case is political. But so it depends on how much control the government has in all areas of life, of the economy, etc. So I would say Cuba definitely is an extreme example. Yep. Venezuela is becoming one, and the other countries don't present such problems. You really can make the separation.
And I think because I think it is implicit in part of this conversation, like you said, that we're talking about human rights lawyers, and that's not the case in Turkey. among these roughly 350 lawyers who are imprisoned. There certainly are among those who were associated with activist causes or were defending, in particular, minority rights or rights of those who participate in left-wing political causes. But the vast majority of these are lawyers who worked for businesses or other institutions that are associated with the Gulen movement. And they didn't go into this to do human rights law.
And what got them in trouble?
What got them in trouble is their affiliation. It's guilt by association. And that's the honest truth about what's happening in Turkey right now, is that we've got something like over 20,000 people in jail following the coup attempt. And these are guilt by association cases. These are not 20,000 people who organized a coup.
So it's not lawyers being punished necessarily for their professional actions.
Some of them may have acted as lawyers, for instance, for Mr. Fethullah Gulen, who lives in America, by the way. It's another story. But some of them may be lawyers in that direct sense, and so the government may really consider them to be direct parties to the crime. But many of them will be lawyers for large companies that are associated with the Gulen movement and that have now been seized by the government, and everyone who worked for that company is suspect, including lawyers. But I think that it problematizes the question of motivation, because yes, of course, when we have human rights defenders and we have lawyers who have chosen a path of defending the oppressed and standing up for others' human rights, of course, they have a special place in our hearts and, in some degree, in the international system. When we're talking about lawyers who are just by virtue of being affiliated professionally, I think it raises a whole other set of questions about how to support them.
Melissa?
Quickly, on Russia, I do think the situation is much more like what you described in China, where you have lawyers that know they're going to be targeted, so they take up this mantle of fighting, and many of them have spent a lot of time outside of Russia, and two of, I think, the leading human rights lawyers in Russia, Sergei Golubok and Kirill Karateyev, spent a lot of time outside Russia and chose to come back because they wanted to push the legal system, and they're both very creative in taking cases and thinking about how they can work within the system, although the system has very recently, I think, tanked, and so both of them are now very worried. Just very quickly, I wanted to mention I also worked a bit in Central Asia, and I know that there has been a turn there to be more toward what you were talking about in terms of having things like oral exams for lawyers, and so that they can be graded such that in order to pass the bar, they have to say the right thing, so that it is much more difficult to become a lawyer in several of the countries in Central Asia unless you agree with the regime.
You have to at least mouth the party line.
And they have to know you mean it.
This is not just a matter, of course, of criminal cases that involve human rights. Civil justice, administrative justice also gets involved. When you think, well, about Singapore, how Lee Kuan Yew used to use defamation cases, civil charges that resulted in huge damage verdicts against political opponents that not only knocked them out of the political battle, but often just made them very, very poor indeed. So you can use civil sanctions. China occasionally has resorted to that, but it hasn't seemed so prominent yet. But of course, there are all kinds of administrative law questions. You should know that in China, this takes place within the context of an increasingly sophisticated legal system. China has made a rather impressive formal system with respect to laws and institutions, procedures, and even legal education. And one question that would be interesting across the board here is, to what extent do lawyers and others get inculcated with what we would say universal, or some say Western legal values? Do they get their ideology, their stimulus, their motivation from law school? In China, until recently, legal education has largely been Western influenced. Although the Chinese legal system is a derivative like the Soviet system before it, of continental European rather than Anglo-American heritage. The fact is that American legal ideology, the fact that so many professors from China have studied in America or UK or Australia, etc., Canada, they have really instilled in many other people the belief in the kind of Western values that China's recent leader of the last 5 years, Xi Jinping, has denounced. And lately, legal education is getting revised in China, and professors are under considerable restraint in terms of even what they can teach in some of the law schools, and some of them are getting demoralized. They don't want to stay in those circumstances, and certainly they can't write or publish what they would like to about certain subjects. But at the same time, the legal system is getting increasingly developed, and the art is to know when lawyers can be free. And by the way, lawyers in China are instruments of corruption also. They're not all gallant, courageous figures. Corruption in the Chinese courts in criminal cases as well as civil and administrative is very great, and many lawyers take part in it for better or worse, or encourage their clients to do so. So it's a very mixed picture. I don't know, Liu Wei, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I can agree you partly, yes, because there is always two kind of different lawyers. One is just like you said, no matter you want or you don't want, but you are in this situation, and if you don't try to persuade your clients to give some money or some gift to the judge, you may get the unfair trial. But on the other hand, there is always some lawyers like us, like human rights lawyers, 死磕派, and we're just fighting, use the law. But sometimes, you know, especially in the criminal cases, it doesn't work. Yeah, no matter what you said, no matter what you're trying to provide to the court, even you submit the evidence showing, yeah, the client is illegal, but, you know, sometimes it doesn't make change. And also, I want to just make an addition point about the sanction in China. Yeah, in this 2 years, many things changed. In the past, the lawyer may facing the crime of picking quarrels, and then it might change into, for example, like the lawyers also join the NGOs may facing the charge of running illegal business. But right now, since July 9th, most of the lawyers was facing the even serious criminal because of they were being charged inciting subversion of the state power, now even to subverting the state political power. So you can see the crime changed. And also the threat to their families, to their selves is even serious than before because of, in the past, it's just the threaten. They invited you to have a tea or talk or just threaten you not to do that. But right now, yeah, it seems they were just trying to let you missing. Not only yourself, but also your family members, just like Professor Cohn mentioned before, the lawyer Wang Yu's son trying to go to another country to get a better education. But he couldn't. A lot of those families couldn't let their sons, their daughters go to another country to get the better education. And also, they put a lot of shames on those lawyers. They let them on the TV show. That is very funny things because of those lawyers will never be able to see their own lawyers, but they were be able to interview by the journalist. Of course, it's government-controlled social media. And they were confessed to see their crimes in the television. And another thing I want to mention is about the law. There have a lot of changes in our law, especially concerned to our lawyers' administration, because everyone knows that in China, we need to renew our license every year. But right now, if you are trying to organize people to hear a trial court, or even to take the interview by another media, like a social media in American, or you are trying to post the cases on your social media like Weibo, WeChat in China, and you will not allowed to do so. And you might be charged by the new crime. And so that is what really happened right now. It's not only threatened from the security police, but also you can see that the law changed. And a lot of lawyers even trying to do something they want to, but when they facing so many threats, when they facing the law changes, and they feel so worried about what they could do right now. Thank you.
If I could just say one quick thing about ideology that you raised, because I think it's under-discussed generally in Turkey or about Turkey. The ideological factor is actually quite important in that the bar associations, in particular the Turkish Bar Association, is very heavily dominated by a Kemalist ideology, which is hardline secularist, very statist. And this is the reason why the current head of the Bar Association, Metin Feyzioğlu, has not actually come to the defense of lawyers in Turkey. And in fact has gone to Europe to argue to the EU and to the Council of Europe that there is no persecution of lawyers in Turkey. Because Feyzioğlu, although he is an opponent of the president, of Erdogan, he is even more so an opponent of what he considers to be subversive Islamist movements, like the Gulen movement. And so this, of course, complicates the picture. You don't have your natural ally from outside should be the bar associations. Some bar associations at the local level may act that way, but at the national level, that may not always be the case.
In China, of course, they have a National Lawyers Association, but it's under the control of the Ministry of Justice. And at every level of government, you have a judicial bureau that really tells the Lawyers Association what to do. Occasionally, lawyers have tried to use democratic methods to get control of certain lawyers' associations, such as once in Beijing, but they've never managed to be very successful. Usually, the bar associations are quiet, but occasionally things have been done that are so awesome, so terrible, that groups of lawyers have spoken out, but not very often.
I just comment that in a couple of countries which are influenced especially by English law traditions, such as Hong Kong and Malaysia, you find another interesting split, which is that the solicitors, who tend to be the commercial lawyers, are kind of, let's get along and sell that house and collect our fee, and the barristers, who are the ones who go to court, tend to be highly ideological to the point where they don't cooperate with each other quite often. But the Asian Affairs Committee of the Bar had a very interesting, unfortunately not very well attended event with the head of the Malaysian Bar Association some months ago, where the government is seeking to rewrite the rules and pass new legislation which governs how the Bar Association is run internally in order to obtain the outcome that the government wishes to have in terms of who will head the Bar Association.
Just to spell out what you've so well said, the Bar Association's ideology tends to be democratic rule of law, whereas the solicitors tend to be pragmatic and they just mind their own situation. That is true, certainly, in Hong Kong. We're moving toward an important subject, which is what can foreigners do about it, if anything? But before we get that, just one other point I think might be interesting based upon the Chinese situation. And that's before this massive campaign began on July 9th, 20 months ago, there were relationships formed between human rights lawyers and their minders, their keepers. They were watched very closely. I'll give you an example. I got to Beijing one night. I called up a leading human rights lawyer, Mr. Jiang Tianyong, who's locked up for a long time, I'm afraid now. And I said, why don't you come over for dinner tonight to my hotel? And he said, oh, I'd like to, but I'll call you back in half an hour. I have to go out and ask my minder. And he went out and he asked his minder. They had a nice relationship. And the minder counseled him. He said, look, if you want to go to your office tomorrow, don't have dinner with Professor Cohen tonight. But he then sent an assistant. And the assistant didn't ask for advice and wasn't considered so controversial at that point. But there is this close regulation on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes friendships arise even between the regulator and the regulated. But another example, in Shanghai, a leading lawyer who went to prison for 3 years because he got involved in controversial cases and he was disbarred. When I see Yu Jie Chun there from Taiwan, we went to visit him and we weren't permitted at first. When we made another attempt, we did go get to see him. And on the way out of his apartment, where we'd had a bite to eat, there was his minder. And the minder was seated there reading the Bible. And because the regulated fellow, Mr. Tseng, he was a believer, and he got friendly with some of his minders, and this guy was bored silly sitting there day after day just watching people come in and out. And so he decided he might as well teach him something about the Bible. So you get these unusual situations, but it's been much less pleasant in recent years under the current leadership, and it appears to be getting even worse. Some of these lawyers are getting 7.5 years in prison. Others are being released, but after performing in a way that's frightening in terms of some of them get locked up, and after a period of incommunicado detention, sometimes fostered by torture, they appear on TV and they say things that you can't believe that they would say voluntarily. And sometimes they are then released and occasionally then repudiate what they had said under coercive circumstances. I don't know if you're...
Subject, if I could. We're the task force on the independence of lawyers and judges. And while judges is not our first priority, judges are a part of the legal system. And I wonder, Melissa, I think you are beginning to help us think about some issues in Poland, and I think the situation there is a very interesting situation and one which is going to be replicated around the world, just like the harassment of lawyers. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. I don't know how to do the quick version. Let's see. It's actually quite technical. And what's fascinating to me is that in response to what's been happening there have been huge protests. And I'm very heartened by the fact that Poles will go out into the streets to protect the constitutional court. But essentially what happened is when you had a changeover in the government, which actually began in 2015, finished in 2016, where you had a complete sort of rework of both the parliament and the sort of executive power. You had a replacement of judges on the Constitutional Tribunal, and then a change in legislation that it totally hamstrung the decision-making such that, for example, the court must hear all of the current cases it has in its backlog before it can hear any new cases. So any new policies that are passed by the current government won't be considered for at least 2 years. And then as a result of that, there was a dissent within the tribunal itself. You had lower courts, some of them saying we're going to ignore the decision or ignore the policies that are hampering the Constitutional Tribunal, and we're going to pay attention to the Constitutional Tribunal's statement of what the law is. Some courts saying we're going to go with what the executive power says, and we're going to only pay attention to these policies, and what the Constitutional Tribunal says is law, it's not law. So you had kind of this dueling legal systems going on in the country, and as a result, well, there was essentially a rule of law crisis. The EU could have stepped in and tried to pressure the Polish government, but because of some difficulties that the EU is having in uniting right now, the EU hasn't been able to restrain Poland. And so there continues to be real difficulties. Unfortunately, the head of the Constitutional Tribunal's term ended in December, and the new government was able to appoint enough people so that they have a majority. So now you're going to see a lot more a lot more laws challenging the Constitution or really not complying with the Constitution being passed in Poland.
In China, in some cases, the court will assign lawyers, replacing those chosen by the defense. So the defense can't pick its own lawyers in controversial cases. And these lawyers who are selected are usually people with some formal or informal relationship to the government. So you know that they're not going to be independent. With respect to the courts, of course, China often features the distinction between independent judges and independent courts. The Constitution speaks in terms of independence of the courts as a unit, not of individual judges, and sometimes that's invoked as a defense against interference with the work of an individual judge. Usually, in any case of importance, you have 3 judges, and it becomes a collective decision. And sometimes the decision simply is told to the courts what to do. In important economic cases, I was involved in a dispute in China once in Shanghai, which is supposed to be a sophisticated place that prides itself in having more rule of law than many other places in the boondocks. And yet in this dispute between a Chinese foreign joint venture and a Chinese company that involved a technical economic question, the courts were helpless. They were just waiting until the Economic Commission and the Bank of China and even the Prime Minister's office in Beijing considered what's the right economic rule that should be applied. And then they told the courts what to do. So the hearings in court were not very meaningful.
One thing that I believe this Bar Association could do, and this particular task force could do, is invite, for example, the authors of this book in Venezuela. Obviously, this wouldn't happen in Cuba. You can get arrested for a pamphlet, but this is an actual book. You can publish stuff in Venezuela. If you're a professor, I wanted to point that out. You, as a law professor, keep teaching law. You can teach. You can criticize the government as much as you want. It's not that agents of the government will crash your class or kick you out or arrest you because of what you're teaching there. So there's a lot of independence of universities still. So these are university professors from Venezuela that wrote this great book called El TSJ al Servicio de la Revolución, which translates to the Supreme Court of Venezuela at the service of the revolution. They document 45,000, they researched 45,000 decisions between 2004 and 2013. among which 0 came against the government. These are all any cases that involve the government where obviously the government won. So they did this amazing work that has just been cited by the OAS Secretary General, the Organization of American States Secretary General this week, Luis Almagro, who's doing great work in raising awareness of the disasters that's going on in Venezuela. And this report by the Secretary General cites this book. So, for example, this is a good example of how things work in practice. So the book is also playing in the screens, which is that these professors, they wanted to keep a low profile generally. One of them came to New York a year ago or so. We invited them to our office, improvised a small little YouTube interview with them. For example, next time they come, I'm definitely going to shoot you an email. Hopefully you can invite them to do something. But they also didn't want to have such a high profile. They wanted to remain sort of as academics that are doing this academic work, just documenting stuff, not going in the face of the government necessarily. But this is the type of thing, I mean, the Secretary General of the OAS citing their book is the type of thing that can land them in trouble. So this is sort of the dynamics that are at play there. And definitely having a bar association in the United States, from any state really, collaborating, I mean, lending a hand is the type of thing that can protect them more, I think.
I should say I'm glad you mentioned books. Because there have been some very good books written about the problems of being a lawyer in China. 2 have appeared recently. One by Eva Pils, who is maybe our most knowledgeable foreign expert on the problems of China's human rights lawyers. She now teaches at King's College in London. She'll be here for 2 weeks in the beginning of April, and you can hear her talk at Columbia or at NYU, other places. And then a very good book by 2 sociologists of law, Terry Halliday of the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, and Sida Liu, a Chinese law-trained person who has become an expert in American sociology of law. And these books will tell you an awful lot if you're interested in pursuing the subject. Well,
I think that Halliday and Liu are speaking. Martin, is that correct?
Yeah, we're working on it.
Stand up and tell everybody.
I don't know when the date are. You're quite against with me, but we're at a book launch here at the City Bar in relation to that book in a few weeks. That will be on the City Bar.
that's definitely worth attending if you can. We ought to cover this problem we've been alluding to delicately about, is there anything we can do to help? I've been involved in many of these cases in China, and the outstanding impression I come away with is the feeling of helplessness. Where can you go? To whom can you appeal? You can't get any help from going to the courts. You try to get help from other lawyers. They're often frustrated in practice. Sometimes they're locked up for their efforts. Prosecutors are supposed to be helpful in really policing, inspecting government violations of the law. That's the prosecutorial, procuratorial system that the Soviet Union built on from Swedish or ancient practice. But they don't really give you any help. The prosecutors, like the police and the courts, are all under control of the local party committee. And it's difficult to do anything about these things. Where can you turn? Publicity? Sometimes in China you can buy publicity. Some journalists, unfortunately, are for sale. And sometimes I've been advised that's the right thing to do to help somebody, because publicity can sway courts. Courts don't want to be criticized by the government. And if there's a public outcry against the court, that could affect people's careers, their promotion, their salary, etc. But usually there's not much you can do. You can go, the last, you might say, resort is to try to get some foreign publicity and to hope that that will help. And sometimes it can help, but more often than not, it doesn't, and sometimes, indeed, it could make things worse. But generally, foreign publicity does help. And many of us, with the permission of families involved, sometimes write about these cases. But bar associations have a role to play. And I'm glad to say that in some countries, this bar association has played a very active and noble role, more important than the American Bar Association. But again, it's limited. One thing in China, there's help from Hong Kong human rights lawyers, and there's help from Taiwan human rights lawyers. And sometimes there are meetings in Taiwan, I've been to a few, where Taiwan lawyers who've struggled after decades of struggle against the Chiang Kai-shek military dictatorship have drawn upon their experience and the increasing success of Taiwan's democratic legal system to bolster the morale of the Chinese lawyers. Chinese lawyers need help. They need financial help, but they also need moral help. They want to know that this madness, their struggle that they're engaging in at huge personal sacrifice is appreciated at least outside China. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of that kind of support to these people. I don't know what your experience is elsewhere. Alyssa, do you have anything on this?
Sure. I do think raising awareness is, of course, very important, and I have often had Russian lawyers say, please get the word out, we need to get the word out. And in Poland, I know that when the Constitutional Tribunal issues were going on, that Senators McCain, Durbin, Cardin wrote a letter to the Polish government saying, we are concerned about your rule of law. And Poles told me that Senator McCain, oh my God, you know, they actually think of McCain as a very important person, while the ruling party sent a very nasty letter back. Most Poles actually thought that that was pretty significant. There are two other things I would quickly say from my experiences talking to lawyers elsewhere that you wouldn't think of being helpful, but I wanted to make sure you know. Be an example. For example, when the Muslim ban originally was put into practice in the US and lawyers by the thousands were at airports, I was getting calls and emails and messages from Russia and Poland and Hungary and all over the place, people saying, I can't believe what you guys are doing. I'm so inspired. We are going to go out and we are going to renew our fight. So that really hit something in a lot of lawyers elsewhere. So kudos to all of you. And then the other thing that you wouldn't think about, and it's hard, but holding our own government accountable, because a lot of the trends that we're seeing in our current government are happening elsewhere. And so if there are ways that we can be, as lawyers, pushing on some of the legal theories and doing what we can here, that can be helpful elsewhere. I think we're now part of a global community of lawyers struggling against some of the issues we're seeing.
I think one thing we should cover also, since you have in your materials the UN Basic Principles on the Rights of Lawyers, and we have in various international covenants, especially Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that some countries have adhered to, real legal protections that somehow should be invoked, and yet frequently are not very effective. China has signed but not ratified the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. It has ratified a number of others. But when they appear before the relevant review committee, often they don't really give honest reports. And often the review committee, year after year, is disappointed in the extent to which the countries that are committed to these values by treaty fail to make them effective. but I don't know whether any of the panel want to talk about attempt somehow to use the international human rights standards in a way that would be effective, whether as mere rhetoric, in publicity, through the use of NGOs, or what can be done in order to implement these international standards.
Turkey's in a unique position, perhaps. I mean, well, Russia just left the European Convention on Human Rights, so that's actually an important development, and it removes a major tool that was being used for a period of time somewhat effectively inside of Russia by lawyers. Turkey is a member still, is still a party to the convention, still has many, many cases against it in the European Court of Human Rights. The unfortunate truth, however, is that they don't implement the decisions. And this has been going on for years. This is not something that's only following the coup attempt. I wanted to, though, pick up on something Melissa said and to reiterate 100% her call to do your jobs here and what that means to people there, especially at a time when we're all more connected and able to see things in real time as they happen. It does change and affects people's perception of whether this is worth it and whether there is something called the rule of law or whether there are things like human rights that can actually be protected. And that matters. I mean, we are facing something in Poland and in Hungary, and I would put Turkey in this group. We're facing governments and states that are purposefully attacking the rule of law. This isn't sort of an accidental byproduct of something else. And when you listen to what the Polish government has to say about it or what the Hungarian government has to say about it, they're very articulate that they don't think the separation of powers and a constitutional democracy is appropriate, that they think that the will of the people is the only valid arbiter of legitimacy. And
Yes.
we really have to fight back. And so we start, great opportunity here. You can start here, but you can help them there too, because it's a articulated perspective that they have, that these politicians and their parties have and that they're using in these countries.
Well, it's time for questions, comments, even answers.
Could I make a request that you identify your name and your affiliation that you're willing to make public when you ask your question or make your statement?
Also, if possible, address your question to specific speakers. But I see the hand up here, please. Do we have a mic for the audience or not? No? You want to take that?
Sure. It's a good question. Turks, or there's been a perception created by the Turkish government that builds on a long tradition of conspiracy thinking in Turkey. There's an excellent new paper out on this actually just today from the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington that I recommend to everyone. There's a perception, yes, that the United States, because Gulen resides in Pennsylvania, the United States must have played a role in this. I should say, in fairness, there's a perception among large parts of the population in Turkey that the UK deep state, the English deep state, has also helped to divide up Turkey, that France at one time tried to divide Turkey, that, on and on and on. I don't think it's worth trying to game out the politics of it. The solidarity matters. There are people who do hear it when it's framed well and when it's said well and when it's in defense of clear values. There are, of course, icebergs or things lurking beneath the surface that have to be navigated, and I would be happy to talk with people about how to navigate those or what those are. But there is also an audience in Turkey that welcomes solidarity internationally.
Liu Wei, you want to say something about China?
Our bar association, it's exactly not really for lawyers. So that's why we build the Women Lawyers Network for Public Interest in China, because we're trying to build the women lawyers real bar association only for our women lawyers, speak out for our women lawyers. Yeah, just like you said, just like Professor Cohn mentioned, because of the bar is not really for lawyers, so it was very difficult for us to balance the situation between the bar and between the bureau because of we were being controlled by them. And every time when the lawyers facing problems or being tortured, and it's supposed to be the bar showing at the first time, but most of the times they didn't show up, and when they show up, they just are trying to take a lawyer back home and not represent the client or just cover everything. But sometimes they do speak out for the human rights lawyers. Sometimes it's in very special situations and in very special circumstances. Yeah, like in Jiansanjiang, some of the bar associations do support the lawyers there.
I think, oh, yes. Yes, please. You got the mic? Oh.
I'm going to just repeat the question because this is being put on tape. The question is to the extent to which lawyers representing LGBT clients are being persecuted, in summary. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm sorry that I didn't know about your interest because just about 10 days ago we had a leading Chinese LGBT lawyer from Shanghai, Mr. Zhou Dan, talk at NYU, and he's talked before at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's working on a doctorate at Harvard Law School now in the hope of using legal education to spread the word. But he says it's beginning to happen. It's difficult, but there have been some landmark cases. And he's not without hope that this could get better. Generally speaking, and one should talk about the role and rights of women, we're beginning to see, even though some of the famous women lawyers got locked up, that they are making more of a dent in certain situations, but they're also under a lot of political pressure. Please.
In Latin America, I wouldn't say this is a problem right now. Cuba was notorious during the 60s for persecuting LGBT people, sending them to concentration camps, well, to forced labor camps. They're called the unidades militares para la producción. They're well documented. There's this great movie, Before Day Comes, is it? Before Dawn by Javier Bardem, and the Before Sunrise, and the book by Reinaldo Arenas, who is the main character in that movie, also documenting that. But as for the past, I think it's 5 years more or less, Mariela Castro, the daughter of Raúl Castro, she's become a champion for LGBT rights. So right now you wouldn't have any problems of that in Cuba, which was the only country really in Latin America, because the right-wing dictatorships of the 70s, the anti-communist dictatorships, they didn't particularly target LGBT rights or the LGBT community. So it was in Latin Latin America has been pretty liberal on that, and except for Cuba, which within this notion of creating the new man, el hombre nuevo, you couldn't be gay, right? So apart from that, and that's not a problem anymore in Cuba. So if you're LGBT and you oppose the government, then they'll persecute you, but not for being LGBT.
Melissa?
And I think in Russia, you would expect there to be some problems because Russia is well known for passing the anti-LGBT propaganda law in 2013. But I think you're seeing the same thing where there was a crackdown on NGOs and a crackdown on people speaking out against the government, and there was the propaganda law, and it was really hard to find an individual lawyer that was working on just those cases. And so lawyers that were being pressured because they were working with opposition, NGOs, and LGBT organizations. There are definitely some lawyers that are part of the LGBT community that were working on some propaganda cases or working on some cases involving hate crimes, and they were I think they were basically not subjected to pressure or persecution by the government, but by community members, and then police were not stepping in. So you definitely see that. And you see that including around trials or around hearings where you would think police should be taking action where they're not.
With respect to what foreign lawyers and bar associations can do, Martin, do you remember what year was it we had the city bar delegation to China, where we visited Shanghai and Beijing? I remember it was like ships that pass in the night. We were trying to spur these people to take a public interest in protecting their human rights lawyers, and they wanted to talk about increasing opportunities for their lawyers to work in American law firms. So we didn't make that much progress, and we've been trying to interest law firms to do something, but the ones that know something about China and care more about their law practice and don't want to get in trouble with the Chinese government.
We've got two questions here.
Yeah.
Gentleman there, and then a lady in blue. So gentleman first. The question is, how can we leverage popular consciousness to relieve the pressure on the bar, specifically in Turkey?
It's a hard question. The media has been the media space has been closed very dramatically inside of Turkey, and that's limiting the opportunities for getting stories out in a way that is going to help mobilize people in Turkey. I do think there is, and we haven't really mentioned it, but I think it's hinted at here by the professor's comment, that delegations and monitoring missions actually can play an important role. They help signal the value that members of the international community place on specific cases or on the situation of people who are being persecuted in general. I've seen firsthand in Turkey cases have different outcomes because of the presence, or what I assume are different outcomes since it's counterfactual, because of the presence of internationals. I think there's still more work to be done in the Turkish case in Europe in particular right now. If we'd had a different election result in the United States, I'd give you a different answer for the United States. I don't think there's much to say there about where this administration is going to go on that. Europe, of course, is Europe in a broad sense, in a very generalized sense, is quite seized right now with what's happening in Turkey. And there are a lot of advocacy opportunities in Strasbourg and in Brussels, and a lot of people who are willing to listen. I think it's up then to the international human rights community and the advocacy community to make an articulate case about what next, because there's a lot of anger in the relationship, both from the Turkish side towards the European interlocutors and from Europe towards Turkey right now. And it's up to maybe some of the outsiders and the NGOs to articulate a case where, okay, geography being geography, we will all continue to be neighbors and to live together. So how do we get past and how do we avoid this falling into a pattern, especially of anti-Semitism and homophobia on one side and Islamophobia on the other side, which it definitely quickly segues into.
Yu Jie-chan.
So the questions are, what should the new American administration do in light of these issues, and what can the bar associations do to lobby the U.S. government to do whatever you think the administration should do? And it's addressed to all the panelists.
It's obvious that Trump has little interest in human rights. And Secretary Tillerson had an opportunity this past weekend to make some assertion along those lines, and he has kept ostentatiously quiet about it. Yes, Liu Wei?
I do want to say, I hope ABA, American Bar Association, could be strong, could have stayed more because of, I can use one example. You can remember that last July, lawyer Wang Yu was being set free on bail. But right before that, ABA gave her prize, Human Rights Lawyers Prize. And even she was being forced to stay on the television said that she will not accept this price. That we all know that in her mind, in her real mind, he would like to accept this price. And we would like to appreciate if ABA and the American Bar Association, any state association could make the strong statement to support Chinese human rights lawyers.
The question is there a role for American lawyers who are in country, in the countries where this persecution is occurring, or for lawyers who are in American corporations to play a role in ameliorating the situation?
I think that's a tough question. For example, we take as many pro bono help from law firms around the world. We have this particular big law firm in Spain that helps us out. And obviously, we're mindful of the fact that they have to do business in authoritarian countries too. So that involves China, Russia, etc. So we submit a list of cases, and we kind of know already what countries they would prefer not to do, just in case. And they'll, for example, they helped us with a case in Azerbaijan because they didn't have particular business there, and Kyrgyzstan, they wanted to help us in Kyrgyzstan as well, but they wouldn't help us with Thailand or Russia or China because they were more interested in that. And that's understandable. So for law firms to be put in that position of, stop being a law firm and advocate their interest, the business interests of their clients, it's tough. So I would say that for bar associations play a more important role in that, for example, the task force for the global persecution of lawyers has that particular mission statement. So obviously, any support from them, I think, is expected and is more valuable at the end of the day. The same kind of goes with the U.S. government. You can't expect that, unfortunately, that they'll have consistent position across the board on all issues when it comes to human rights. Unfortunately, you can expect that one office at the State Department will do that, but that the president will say that on every single meeting with every leader of the world, it's tougher to expect. However, to expect that the American Bar Association or the New York City Bar Association are going to express their concern and their help to persecuted lawyers around the world, definitely that's something that it has the same effect. For the governments are going to denounce it as U.S. interference, etc. But the reality is that most people can read between the lines, and very few people really believe that it's the U.S. government and the CIA behind it. Most people know that it's the American Bar Association, decent lawyers, the New York City Bar Association, decent lawyers that care about their colleagues in those countries that are issuing this statement, period. And for those people that are receiving the prizes, and it makes a big deal of a difference. And now that I'm talking about this, I wanted to talk about what Professor Cohen mentioned about the international systems to bring these cases to. There's this set of semi-judicial bodies at the UN. You saw, I spoke about the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, but there's also the UN Special Rapporteur on Independence of Lawyers and Judges. So that is a person that you want to have invited frequently to participate in events by this task force. And while they don't have the power to issue court decisions condemning, they do issue communications. They do ask states about what they're doing with people, with dissidents, with lawyers, with persecuted lawyers, etc. And a lot of countries pay attention to that. Cuba, for example, does pay attention to that. They do respond. For example, it's the case that I mentioned briefly in my presentation, Danilo Maldonado's, he was released 4 days after we knew that the Cuban government had received a specific communication by the working group. Maybe it's a coincidence, we never know, but most likely it played a role, because no one cares about this guy versus the UN is asking about this guy right now. I don't want this particular problem. So it does make a difference. So I think there's a lot of work to do there, like soft litigation type work.
I think those are excellent points. China, under great pressure over a long period of time, has allowed 2 UN special rapporteurs to visit. And those reports they've made, I think, have made a big impact. And China's not likely to invite any others back, I think, for a foreseeable future. other thing is this curious working group on arbitrary detention. It must have handled at least 40 cases involving China. Each time it condemns what the Chinese have done, and each time it has no impact whatever. There's a failure of publicity. There's a failure of making the most of these opportunities. The UN generally isn't great on human rights, but when this group acts, there should be much more made of it. Unfortunately, it's not marked.
Sorry, yeah, we promised this lady first. So the question is, for those who are going to hear this later, can membership in international organizations which are not primarily focused on human rights be used as a tool to affect member countries' treatment of human rights issues?
I think for the EU, I should probably talk about Turkey. It's a great question. It's highly relevant. Turkey, if we were having this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, I think the answer would have been maybe, and that it's still open and possibly. The answer right now is no in the Turkish case, which is a very important case for EU accession and this notion of transformation or socialization, as some in international relations would call it. The accession process remains open for Turkey. They are technically a candidate country. However, for a variety of political reasons that predate the crackdown, including relations with Cyprus, the key chapters concerning judicial independence and framework and human rights, these are chapters 23 and 24, have not been opened in the Turkish case. It seems unlikely that they will be opened anytime soon. And even if they were, the process itself really has collapsed as a process. And then there's a much larger conversation here to be had about EU enlargement in general, which is faltering in the only other area where it's moving forward, which was technically moving forward in the Western Balkans. There as well, you have a number of increasingly authoritarian states, not with such dramatic crackdowns as you have in Turkey, but states where there's clear indications of state capture, high degrees of removal of judicial independence, removal of checks and balances, and yet the EU accession process goes forward. And without taking us off on too far a tangent, among those who look at these kinds of things, there's a big question of whether there's a process of reverse socialization, of whether the attempt to absorb authoritarian countries into these blocks has actually started to erode the values and the principles of the organizations themselves, and to undermine them. In the case of Hungary, the case of Poland, within the EU, blocking for each other, Hungary acting as a blocker on rule of law mechanism against Poland is one of the key examples of this. So unfortunately, in the EU case, I'm afraid we've seen very stark limits to what we thought 5 or 10 years ago was a really powerful case of transformation.
Melissa and then Mark.
Just really quickly, I think that corruption as an issue was an issue that was gaining a lot of ground in terms of an area where the international community could perhaps pull Russia in through the OECD and have an effect on practices in Russia. I think that similarly now, what you're seeing with the current U.S. government saying that perhaps the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act should not be something that the U.S. should be pushing internationally, whereas it had started to become a standard. And when I was in Russia, we were doing a lot of trainings on the FCPA, and this was something that you were seeing other countries and companies in other countries wanting to learn about because they saw it as an international standard. If our U.S. government is going to say that the FCPA is no longer a standard, that it does not want it to be a standard, I think we're going to have problems internationally with the standard basically becoming degraded. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing now.
Mark Schulman, who's chair of one of the sponsoring committees of the association.
So what things are happening in the United States that make you worried, panelists, and what things are happening in the United States that give you hope?
I'm not worried about the U.S. Eroding into an authoritarian regime. I think it would be very difficult for the U.S. to go down that path, even though clearly we have a president with authoritarian tendencies. So if Donald Trump happened to be the president of Venezuela in 1999, in very few years you would have something play out very similar, I would guess, to what it's in Venezuela, in the sense that it's much easier to remove all of a sudden the court system. In the case of Venezuela, his government passed a law, Hugo Chavez's government passed a law in 2003, calling for the election of 4 times as many judges as they had in the Supreme Court. It's a larger Supreme Court system. So as a result, he suddenly had 3/4 of all votes in the Supreme Court, and that's where the problem started. In Bolivia, similarly, the social movements of Evo Morales took over the Constitutional Tribunal by reducing their salaries, by doing a couple of things, and they very quickly could take over the complete system. So in a lot of countries in the world that followed the German example, the Constitutional Tribunal system, and even in just unitarian countries that have Supreme Court of Justices around the world, if you take either the constitutional branch of the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Tribunal directly, that's all you need in order to take over completely. And that's the start. Then you go after the media, the political opposition, everything, nothing can stop you. Here, he appointed one Supreme Court justice, and the guy is like on the record saying that he's not Donald Trump's stooge, that he would have walked out if he was asked to reverse Roe v. Wade. That level of independence, it's unthinkable in a lot of the countries that we're talking about. So that this U.S. legal system, and that's just talking about the Supreme Court. That's not even talking about all the circuit court system within the federal government. That's not talking about the 50-some state judicial systems that have their own domains, and they do rule on criminal law. They do rule on so many aspects. It's the uniqueness of the federal system in the U.S. allows for a big degree of protection that you don't see in a lot of the countries that we deal with.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, but lest I come off too optimistic, there is still something very dangerous that's happening, and I think that's the collapse of norms and the erosion of the norms that underpin the whole system. I mean, this is all a fiction, right? We all know that this is all based on our agreement that these things are real and that we continue to abide by them. That's how it works. And if we have consistently demonstrated over and over again, including by the highest office holder in the country, that those things are not to be respected, that it does erode and it does affect our sense of our agreement, right? The social agreement that there is a system of law and that it applies to all of us equally. And so I'm very worried about that. I don't think that it's kind of this apocalyptic scenario or that we tip right over into Venezuela or Turkey or something. But I do think that it undercuts a lot of the things that we take for granted. And I think that's actually why it's so important to be speaking out and to be articulating what those values are repeatedly in public, including from things like the Bar Association, is to reaffirm them and to make sure that they don't erode further.
Their way?
Yes. You can't imagine that, how disappointed when I saw Trump win the election. Yeah. I talked to a lot of Chinese students in law school, and most of them think that, oh, yeah, let's see. So better, China may be better than U.S. in the future, you know. But that's funny because in my opinion, I would like to believe that democracy is much better than authority, of course. But I do worry about the feminist movement, the women's rights in U.S. I also joined the march in Washington, D.C., and also host on on International Women's Day, wearing red and coming to the square and posted with the other feminists, no matter in what kind of color, you know. Even a lot of Chinese students, they are feminists, they were all coming to the street and protest. So I think it will be getting better. I still have strong belief in U.S. It's much better than China. Yes.
We have time for one or two more questions, and we'll have to close. Yes, please.
Just a comment was made from the audience that there's a proposal in the Florida legislature to have a law which will allow the legislature to decide that the court was wrong, in effect. So, and to all you transactional and tax lawyers out there, I'm one of you too. So you don't have to be a crazy human rights person or a liberal or a Democrat or any of those bad things. You can be in favor of lawyers not being beaten and killed no matter what your professional job is.
Well, on that comforting note, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank our organizers of this interesting event. And let's hope things get better at home and abroad. Thank you.